A Cyprus-flagged tanker sits dead in the water, boarded by armed men in unmarked boats. 20 nautical miles away, a U.S. Navy escort vessel changes course. This is not a drill. This happened on July 1st, 2026. Iran's Revolutionary Guard says it hit 2 tankers transiting the strait under American escort. Within hours, oil markets moved. West Texas Intermediate jumped past $84 a barrel. Brent crossed $90. Signal number 1. This is not the first time this month it's happened. Because 2 weeks earlier, on July 13th, Iran and the United States traded direct strikes over the same stretch of water for 3 straight days. The U.S. Central Command said its aircraft hit dozens of targets to degrade Iran's ability to threaten shipping. Brent crude spiked more than 9% in 48 hours. Traffic through Hormuz collapsed by over half. That's the world right now. But to understand how we got here, you have to go back 5 months, because in February 2026, the same standoff already exploded into something almost nobody alive has seen before. And there is a detail buried in that explosion that most coverage still hasn't fully explained. 441 kilograms. Hold that number. We'll come back to it. Let's rewind. By late February 2026, U.S. envoy Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner had already sat across the table from Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi 3 times. Omani Foreign Minister Badr al-Busaidi was the courier, shuttling messages between rooms, because Washington and Tehran still wouldn't speak to each other directly. On February 26th, in Geneva, Oman called it substantial progress. Araghchi called it clear seriousness. Iran had reportedly offered to dilute its stockpile of uranium enriched to 60%. Edging toward weapons grade, down to lower levels. The U.S. wanted more. It wanted Iran to give up virtually all of it and to accept a deal with no expiration date. Trump came out of that round and said he wasn't happy with how Iran was negotiating. Here's the catch. Less than 48 hours later, everything changed. On the morning of February 28, 2026, Israeli and American aircraft struck targets across Iran, including the compound where Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei was working. He did not survive. He was 86 years old, and he had ruled Iran since 1989. Trump confirmed it hours later, calling him one of the most evil people in history. Israel said it also killed the commander of the Revolutionary Guard, Iran's defense minister, and the secretary of its Supreme National Security Council in the same wave of strikes. Iran declared 40 days of national mourning. A council was set up almost overnight to keep the state running. Within days, Khamenei's son, Mojtaba, moved into position to succeed him as supreme leader. This was not a symbolic strike. This was a decapitation operation aimed at the top of the Iranian state, and it worked. Iran hit back immediately, missiles toward Israel, missiles toward the U.S. Fifth Fleet's facility in Bahrain. The Strait of Hormuz effectively shut down. Hezbollah, Iran's ally in Lebanon, opened a second front against Israel. Israeli ground forces moved into southern Lebanon. Here's what nobody fully explains when they cover this story. The retaliation was fast, but it was also limited. Iran hit back hard enough to save face, not hard enough to invite a full invasion. That restraint bought time for diplomacy to crawl back in. By April 8th, Pakistan brokered a 2-week ceasefire between Washington and Tehran, tied to reopening Hormuz. Trump extended it indefinitely 2 weeks later. Then, in June 2026, the presidents of Iran and the United States signed something almost nobody predicted 6 months earlier, a memorandum of understanding to formally end the war. Iran agreed, on paper, to 3 things. Never pursue nuclear weapons. Agree to a pathway to dilute its enriched uranium stockpile under UN inspection. And discuss, not necessarily abandon, its right to enrich uranium at all. For a few weeks, it looked like it might actually hold. Oil prices eased back toward pre-war levels. But here's the catch nobody wants to say out loud. Technical talks meant to lock in that memorandum stalled almost immediately. And by mid-July, fighting over the Strait of Hormuz had reignited hard enough to erase most of that calm. Now, the number. Before the February strikes, the International Atomic Energy Agency had tracked Iran's stockpile of uranium enriched to 60% purity, one short technical step from weapons grade, at 440.9 kilograms. It also tracked another 184.1 kilograms enriched up to 20%. That's the shocking detail nobody has fully resolved. After the strikes, IAEA inspectors lost all access. They still don't know exactly where that material physically is or what condition it's in. Iran's Foreign Minister Araghchi told CBS in March that the country's enriched uranium is, in his words, under the rubble, and that Iran has no plan to dig it out. Independent analysts who reviewed the strike damage say Iran's ability to build a working nuclear device, once estimated at a matter of months, has likely been pushed back to a year or more. But likely is not confirmed. Nobody outside Iran has laid eyes on that stockpile since June of last year. That uncertainty is the single biggest reason this crisis refuses to fully end. You cannot verify a deal you cannot inspect. And in July 2026, satellite imagery of the Parchin military complex, specifically a site called Talagon 2, which was hit hard in the March strikes, showed something analysts didn't expect. Repair and stabilization work underway in plain sight from orbit. Iran says it isn't rebuilding a weapons program. The imagery says Iran is, at minimum, rebuilding something. Now for the domino effect, because this isn't just a Middle East story, it's a global oil story. About a fifth of the world's traded oil and a huge share of its liquefied natural gas passes through the 33-kilometer-wide Strait of Hormuz. When fighting first erupted in late February and March, Brent crude tore past $114 a barrel. Some trading desks were modeling scenarios above $140. By late March, with U.S. officials openly discussing seizing control of the strait to keep it open, prices whipsawed nearly 9% lower in a single session on hopes of de-escalation. Wall Street analysts, in briefings picked up by Bloomberg, warned that a prolonged full closure of Hormuz could realistically push oil toward $170, and in the most extreme scenarios, $200 a barrel. At $170 oil, the math gets brutal fast. Inflation reaccelerates. Central banks that spent 2 years trying to cut interest rates get boxed back into holding them high, or raising them again. Europe, still dependent on secure energy routes from the Gulf, faces the kind of diesel shortages analysts started comparing to the 1970s oil shocks. That's not hypothetical anymore. It already happened once, in March. It's the risk sitting on the table again right now. So who's actually driving each side's decisions? This is where the internal friction matters most. On the Israeli side, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's stated objective during the February strikes wasn't just degrading the nuclear program. Israeli officials said the goal was ending the Ayatollah's regime outright. That's a much bigger ambition than stop the enrichment. And it puts Netanyahu at odds with anyone in Washington who wants a negotiated off-ramp instead of regime change. On the Gulf Arab side, a joint statement from the Gulf Cooperation Council after the June memorandum was blunt. Lasting peace, they said, requires addressing the full spectrum of Iran's threats. Its ballistic missiles, its drones, its armed proxies across the region. Not just the uranium. That's a much wider bar than what Iran actually signed up to in June. On Iran's side, the new leadership under Mojtaba Khamenei is untested. A council installed almost overnight after a decapitation strike does not have 37 years of accumulated authority behind it the way his father did. Hardliners inside Iran's security establishment, the same Revolutionary Guard that just watched its commander get killed, have every incentive to prove Iran wasn't broken. Striking tankers in Hormuz is exactly that kind of proof. Every side has a hardliner faction, whose political survival depends on looking strong, not on compromising. That is the engine that keeps dragging this back to the brink every time diplomacy makes progress. Here's the pivot, because this is where most coverage stops, and where the real story actually is. The June memorandum wasn't fake, it was real, it was signed by both presidents, and for a few weeks it worked exactly as intended. But a memorandum is not a verified, monitored, permanent settlement. It's a pause with conditions attached, and both sides have already shown they'll break those conditions the moment their internal hardliners demand it. Shuttle diplomacy is still the only channel that exists. Oman's foreign minister is still the man in the middle, relaying language nobody will say to each other's faces directly. That indirect structure is fragile by design. Every leaked detail, every senior official familiar with the talks, every unconfirmed report about a new proposal can blow up momentum built over weeks in a matter of hours. And right now, the loudest signals are not coming from negotiating rooms. They're coming from the Strait of Hormuz, where tankers are getting boarded in the middle of the night. So where does this actually go in the next 24 to 72 hours? There are really only two paths left on the table, and both are already partially in motion. Path 1, the memorandum gets rescued. Technical talks resume. IAEA inspectors regain access to verify where that 440-kilogram stockpile actually is, and the tanker attacks get walked back through Omani mediation before oil crosses $100 again. Path 2. The Hormuz fighting escalates faster than diplomacy can catch up. Oil keeps climbing toward the $120, then $170 range analysts have already modeled. And a war that technically has a peace agreement on paper resumes in practice. Nobody outside a handful of rooms in Muscat, Tehran, and Washington knows which path wins this week. What we do know is this. Iran was bombed. Its supreme leader was killed. Its nuclear sites were hit hard enough that even Iran's own foreign minister says the stockpile is buried under rubble. But 5 months later, Iran is still standing, still negotiating, still striking back in the Strait of Hormuz, and still, as of this week, refusing to fully back down. Deal or bombs, peace or war. The next 72 hours decide which one the world wakes up to.